Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you guys are new. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my palette ranking for Q3 of 2023, and this is based on the actual amount of times I've used my palettes. So every single day I write down the palette that I used for the day, or if I didn't wear makeup, I also document that. And then at the end of each quarter, I tally everything up and give you guys a ranking list. So this one's especially exciting because it's our last one for the end of the year before our finale. So when I update you guys at the end of December, it will be for the entire year and you guys will be able to see what palette I used the most for the whole year. But for today, I'm going to be sharing the ranking from July through September. If you're curious about Q1 or 2 from this year, I'll have those linked down below for you. But let's go ahead and jump into the ranking. So I've got 11 different spots. There's a lot of ties. So starting in spot number 11 are the palettes that I only used one time in Q3. Let's start out with the palette that I actually don't own anymore, but I did use the Juvia's Place Warrior palette one time in Q3. I'll pop a picture up right here for you guys so you can see what it looks like, but this palette I just never reached for. I had that same sentiment for over a year, and so ultimately I did decide to declutter that and gift it to a friend who I think is getting more use out of it than I was. I just didn't reach for it enough, but I did reach for it one time in Q3, and I think all the other palettes I do actually own, so that'll be the only one I have to pop a picture up for. But the next palette that I actually only used one time, I'm kind of surprised by this, but it's the Kathleen Lights and Il Makiage Disco Fox palette. This is one of the most expensive palettes in my collection, so it does make me a bit sad that I have only used it once in 3 months. Like, that's kind of crazy. But honestly, I do think this is a really pretty palette. I love the shimmer shades in this palette. It's fun to create like a more kind of glam look. I feel like I'll be using this a lot in December around the holiday time, but I only used it once in the whole Q3 of the year. Another palette I only used once was this one from Myra Cosmetics. This is the Chasing Eternity palette. I really like this palette, and actually this was one of my very favorite palettes from last year, I believe, when I won this in a giveaway from the brand on their Instagram, and I really fell in love with this palette. I still do like it, but I just feel like I don't reach for it quite as much. I always mention this when I talk about this palette, but this shade called Eternity is one of my favorite shimmer shades in my whole collection. So I have reached for it a little bit in October, but that doesn't count in this ranking video. So yeah, I only used it once in the whole Q3, which is just kind of mind-blowing. I love this video series because it really reminds me to reach for the palettes I already have. Like, I would have never guessed I only used this once in the whole quarter, but knowing that makes me want to reach for it more. So that's something I really love about this ranking video. The last two palettes in spot number 11 are both from Nomad Cosmetics. So the first one is the Nomad Iceland palette. I reached for this once. This is typically a palette that I don't use as much as my other one just because it is so colorful. I tend to reach for a lot of neutral tones, and especially this year, I've really been, for some reason, straying away from colorful shadows. So it doesn't surprise me that I only use this once. But I definitely want to pull this into my Shop My Stash rotation for the winter time because I love reaching into these blue tones for some more fun type looks. So I am really excited to use this one a little bit more in the winter time. And then the other Nomad palette that I used once is this Cartagena palette. I really like this one, and again, I'm surprised I only used it once because I really do like this one for summer. But like I said, this year I've just been a lot more into neutral tones, and also this summer was not very makeup forward for me. I just really wasn't reaching for makeup a lot after a very terrible loss that we had in May, and so makeup has not been the first thing on my mind for the most part of this entire year. So I think that that's going to kind of show in the ranking as well. You're going to see a lot more neutral palettes towards the top, and I think that just kind of makes sense. Okay, so those are all the palettes that I only used once in Q3. So in spot number 10 are many palettes that I used twice in the quarter. So I used this one from Essence twice. This is the Coral Me Maybe palette. I go back and forth about whether or not I want to declutter this like all the time. I use it twice in the quarter, but I also have palettes I only used once that I like more than this one, and I use this one twice. So I just go back and forth about it. It's such a small little compact palette that I do tend to keep it around. This is the only 6-pan palette from Essence that I still have in my collection, and I think I keep it around because it does have those warm tone shadows, and the shimmer shades are very wearable. In comparison to the Nomad Cartagena palette we just talked about, that one's a little bit more vibrant and intense, whereas these are warm tones that I feel more confident wearing like during the week to my corporate job. So I just typically feel a little bit more confident in something more neutral like that. So I think that's kind of been why I've kept it around some. Another palette that I used twice, I actually have this one on the eyes today. This is the Huda Nude Light palette. I have pan in every single one of these shadows. I find myself not reaching for this one so much anymore because I have newer palettes, but also because I do have such large pans in some of the shades that they're hard to reach into. So I'm kind of thinking about like repressing this entire palette. It might be a little bit sad because I have pan in every single shade, and it would be sad to like wipe that away, but it would also maybe reignite my love for this palette because then I could try to hit pan on the shades again once I've repressed them. So that's something I'm really considering doing with this palette, but I did only use this twice in the third quarter. Another one that doesn't get a ton of use for me, but I really enjoy this one in my collection. This is the Mini Avocado palette from Revolution Beauty. I think this is the I Heart Revolution brand. They've got like several different little brands, but this is a mini tasty avocado palette, and I love this one. I don't plan on ever getting rid of this palette. I really enjoy it. It's just fun every now and then for like a really bold, fun green look. The shimmer shades are super foiled and metallic and just very intense. So again, this is not the type palette that I'm wearing to my 9 to 5, but I love to wear this on the weekends or for filming. So I always want to keep this in my collection. I honestly just really love it. I feel like I always get so surprised in these ranking videos, but this one is no exception. I'm very surprised I only used this one twice, but this is the Hanging in Hawaii palette from BH Cosmetics. I really enjoy this one. I will say though, I tend to only reach for these first two columns. I don't tend to reach for any of these shades on the right, so I don't know if that has something to do with it because I don't reach for the whole thing, but I love the shimmer shades, especially these 4 right here. And then I also really like this matte shade a lot, so I do enjoy the palette. The shimmer shades do not crease on the lid whether or not I have NYX glitter primer underneath, and this wears so well all day. It was so affordable. I got it for like $7 at TJ Maxx. It's just a real winner to me, but I only used it twice. Another one in spot number 10 is the ColourPop That's Taupe palette. This one is such a stunning cool toned neutral palette, but it does tend to actually go smokier than I like because this is really the only shade that's not smoky on me. These two even can really like deepen up a look. So sometimes I feel like I shy away from it because it doesn't feel as everyday to me, which is kind of funny because when you look at it, I feel like the shades don't look that deep, but for some reason I feel like when I put them on the eyes, they feel like a lot more intense than what I was expecting. But that's kind of similar to the Natasha Denona Glam palette, which this one's almost a dupe for, but I don't know. I feel like when I only reach for the lightest matte shade, then I just feel like I'm creating the same look out of the palette every time, but I do really like this palette. And I think it's a really great one, especially for an affordable price tag. And especially if you don't want to buy the Natasha Denona Glam one, which is almost $70. This one's probably like $14 or something, so it's a lot cheaper. All right, we've got 2 more palettes that I used twice in quarter 3. So the next one is the Persona Identity palette. This one is one that I loved when I first got it, but now I feel like I forget about it. It just goes a little bit unforgotten in my collection. Again, this is a palette where I tend to only use about half the shades in the palette, which is such a bummer, and that sentiment in itself has also changed how I purchase palettes now. I really try not to purchase palettes where I don't think I would use half the shades, but these on the bottom are just very deep shadows, and I tend to not like deep shadows just on my fair skin and with my eye shape. I feel like it really closes off my eyes and it's just not my preference, but they're beautiful shadows. So I tend to only use mostly all these shimmer shades here, and then I will dip between the 2 of these, but even these are pretty deep for my skin tone, which is why I have such a large pan in this light tan shade, because I have to mix it with any other matte shade in the palette. So I don't find this one as user-friendly. I wouldn't really want to travel with this palette for that same reason, but I love the shimmer shades in this, and that's why I keep this palette. So the shade here called Sassy is my all-time favorite inner corner highlight of anything in my collection. So it just goes to show sometimes it's worth it to keep a palette around, even just for a couple shades. But moving forward, I try not to buy palettes for that reason. Okay, the last one in spot number 10 that I used twice is another Nomad palette, and this is the Okavango Safari palette. This one I was so excited to see them launch because it's a neutral palette, and Nomad typically has such colorful palettes, but something about this just wasn't like 100% my favorite thing, and I think it kind of boils down to that same thing as the Persona Identity palette. It just has so many intense colors still. I do love this column right here with the lighter shades, but I tend to just shy away from more mid to deep tone matte shades for my own preferences. I do really like that they have that as an option, but for me, I just feel like I don't use 2 of the columns very much in the palette, so I don't know. I think that's really why I don't reach for this one so much, but it is a very nice palette. Okay, now is where I think you're going to start seeing a theme of how all of the palettes look. So in spot number 9 are the palettes that I used 3 times in quarter 3. So the first one is this Sydney Grace Unbreakable Bonds palette. And I felt like I used this one more than 3 times, but that's what I had on my little calendars from where I tallied everything up. So this one is a very nice palette again, but I feel like maybe I didn't exactly need to add it to my collection. I do really love the formula. It's a great palette. I just have so many palettes. It's hard to focus on every one of them. So this one unfortunately seems to have gotten a little bit forgotten in my collection. So again, this is a nice reminder for me to reach for it. And this is an example of something I really love in a palette where they offer a light version and a deep version, so you can actually choose based on your preferences what palette you want. So I picked up the lighter one, so I do really like that it has a couple of these lighter matte shades, and then even these two are pretty light as well. So I do really enjoy this palette. I love the variety. Another palette that I used 3 times is another neutral palette. This one is actually called the Nearly Natural palette by Glaminatrix Cosmetics. I do really enjoy this palette, but I will say that sometimes the shimmer shades crease on me more than some of my other palettes, so I have to be careful about them. They're also super intense shimmer shades. So while they're more neutral, they do lean to that nearly category of nearly neutral. So they're not so wearable for me. They're beautiful and I feel confident wearing them like wherever, except for I just like to wear a little bit more subdued eyeshadow to work. And I spend so much time at work that I tend to reach for the other palettes that can give me that sort of a look over this one. But I do feel like this adds something to my collection because I love a glam look, but I also love a glam neutral look. And that's what this gives me because I could still use my favorite gold and pink sort of tones or even a more like neutral green tone. I think green is a neutral. But I love reaching for these shadows because it's not like I'm reaching for a hot pink shade that I now don't feel so comfortable in. I honestly just love the confidence that I have when I wear this palette, so I do really enjoy having it in my collection. And then the last palette that I wore 3 times in quarter 3 is this one from Huda. This is the New Nude palette. This one's a staple for me. I picked this up late in the game. I've only had it for a couple of years now, but I know this one's been out for a while, but I love this palette. These 2 shimmer shades are 2 of my favorite in my whole collection. I really like this one a lot. This is a perfect fall time palette, so I need to reach for this one more like this time of year. But those were all the palettes in spot number 9. So moving on to spot number 8 is the palette that I used 4 times. And that is another palette from Huda. This is the Mercury Retrograde palette. You guys know that I replaced this palette, so I had an old one that had a ton of pan in it, but it was getting to the point where it was getting expired. So I repurchased it just before it got discontinued, and I'm so glad I did that because I still do really love this palette. The shimmer shades in it are so pretty. I would say out of the entire palette, there's only like 4 shades I don't tend to reach for, and it's this shimmery purple and then the 2 blue shades, and then I don't tend to reach for this hot mess shade very much. Vortex I'll use sometimes as a liner, but I still do find it to be purposeful in the palette. But for this whole palette, for me to just really not reach for like 3 to 4 shades, I think that's pretty good. Occasionally I do reach into hot mess and occasionally I reach into ultraviolet, so that's why I'm saying like 3 to 4 shades, but I really like this one. I think it's such a staple palette in my collection. This is one of the main palettes that when I think back on like what made me love makeup and what made me like fall in love with makeup, I actually remember the day that this launched and I saw it for the first time and I was so obsessed with it. And I was actually with my coworker at the time. This was in college, and he was like, if you're that obsessed with it, you just need to buy it. So I bought this for myself as my college graduation gift, and I've never looked back. I waited several months before actually purchasing it because it's pretty pricey. And this was the most expensive palette I'd ever bought at the time. I'd really never invested in makeup like that, and my collection was not like it is now. So this was a very eye-opening palette for me, and it like really helped me get into the theme and the style of makeup that I really enjoy and I feel the most confident in. So I've always just really loved this palette, and it brings back really fun memories for me. And spot number 7 are 2 palettes that I used 5 times. So the first one is the Pastel Dreams palette from Give Me Glow Cosmetics. I finally hit pan in this shade called Lavender Sky. I was focusing on this one and I was so happy to finally hit pan in my favorite shade of the palette. So I used that one 5 times, which I think is pretty good for using that in Q3, as I tend to find this as a spring palette. So I'm really happy to say that I used it 5 times in the summer months. I tend to forget about that one when it's not springtime. And then the other palette I used 5 times is this one from Natasha Denona. This is the Mini Starlit palette. This one is a recent launch. I think it just came out in September, like the very beginning of September or maybe the end of August. But I picked this up. This is the first and only mini Natasha Denona palette that I've ever owned, and I really like this. So I ended up taking this on a couple of trips. We went to the beach and I took this one, and then we went on our anniversary trip actually in October and I took this again. So I really like to travel with this palette. I love the shimmer shade right here. I find that this is a very well-rounded little palette for me. I love that it doesn't go too deep. However, I just wish they would have come out with 2. Like, that's what I want. I want a light palette, but I know not everyone does. So I wish that they would come out with like 2 different versions so that it was more well-rounded for everyone. I feel like since she has so many of these little mini palettes out that there are a lot of options and we don't need to own them all. So if this one is lighter than what your preferences are, then check out some of her other ones, because I feel like some of her other ones are deeper than this one, but I really like this one. Okay, and spot number 6 is a palette that I used 7 times, and this one has become a favorite of mine. So this is the Viseart Cashmere palette. I really like this one. I feel like it is a perfect color story for me. I don't really reach for this shade here, but outside of that, I reach for like everything else. And this shimmery purple shade is one of my favorite in my whole collection. I love this one. I find it to be so flattering on the eyelids, but also these shades are so pigmented that I don't even know that I could ever hit pan on them. This shade is currently in my eyeshadow project pan. I'm just trying to focus on one shadow at a time, but it's honestly more so just to use it and enjoy it more, because I don't know that I can hit pan on it, but I really do like this palette a lot. Okay, we're into the top 5 spots now, but I have 6 palettes left to talk about, and I think you guys are gonna be surprised about this one. I was when I was totaling them up. So in spot number 5, I used this palette 10 times, and it is the Lethal Cosmetics custom palette that I created on their website. I know why I used this 10 times. It's because I was filming with it for a review for you guys, and then also just trying to figure out the formula so that I could get my thoughts together a little bit better for that review video as well. So I know that that's really why I was reaching for it so much, but I have been enjoying this more than when I first purchased it. If you want a more in-depth review, I have a very in-depth review on this video with a lot of timestamps on it as well. So you can just scroll and look at exactly what you were wanting to look for. But I'm extremely surprised I used this 10 times and that it's spot number 5 in the whole ranking. So that really surprises me because I was not a fan of this when I first got it in the mail. Okay, so now we've jumped up into the ones I was really using the most. These are my favorites from the last quarter. Now we're gonna talk about the top 5 palettes that I have just been loving so much. The numbers are gonna jump high. So in spot number 5 for the Lethal palette, remember that was 10 uses. So now we're jumping up to 14 uses for spot number 4, and that was the Huda Rose Quartz palette. I am so glad I repurchased this palette. I picked it up in July on sale. I used to have this palette and then I ended up returning it. I feel like I've talked about it a lot, but I really missed this palette. So when I saw it on sale for 50% off, I picked it up and I have been using it quite a bit since then. So obviously in Q3, I did use this 14 times, but I even just used it a couple of days ago. I think I actually used it yesterday. I really like this one. This shade here called Energized has been one of my favorite shades, again, in my whole collection. It's just been such a favorite. I do stand by what I said when I first tried this palette out, that the more like blue tone shades are not my favorite, but outside of that, I really do like this palette, and especially for half off, I'm so glad I picked it up again because I've really been enjoying it. And I love the packaging of this palette. Huda gets me with this packaging. Like, I love how she lays it all out. I love the format of this palette. I'm not one for like the Anastasia palettes where it's like 2 long rows. I much prefer something like this. I find it a lot more appealing, but I also love the plastic packaging that she uses where you can kind of see through the inner portion of the palette. I really, really like that. So this one I'm so glad to have back in my collection. Okay, spot number 3, I have 2 palettes and I used both of these 17 times. So this one it's not the easiest to mark because I've moved around all of the shadows. So you're gonna see this palette and you're gonna think, did you really use that 17 times? I did not use this arrangement of this palette 17 times. So this is the Natasha Denona My Dream palette. I rearranged the 3 Natasha Denona palettes that I have to create my perfect custom Natasha Denona palette. So I used that palette a lot of times, but it's comprised of all 3 of the palettes. So every time I'm reaching into that palette, I'm really reaching into all 3 of these. So any day that I use that custom palette, I put 1 mark by each of the palettes that makes up that palette, if that makes sense, because that would be way too much to track if I was trying to figure out exactly what shade I was using, like where it came from. So because that palette's pretty equally made up of all 3 palettes, I just counted all 3 of them every time that I used it. So the My Dream palette and then our next one, the Glam palette, I used 17 times. So that could have been that I used it, you know, a couple of times before I created the custom palette, and then after that I used it as the custom palette. But this is what my Glam palette's looking like right now. So I haven't actually reached into either one of these since I created the custom palette, but I did use shades from both of these palettes 17 times, which leads us to spot number 2. I used this palette 20 times, and this is the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. So this one was new from September, and so I used this as the I Need a Nude palette, but then when I created this palette out of it with this color story, I have been using this nonstop. So I've used this palette or shades from this palette 20 times, and this is the actual one that I've been reaching for out of the 3, which is kind of a bummer because those palettes are super expensive. So it is a little bit of a bummer that I'm only reaching for 1/3 of all of those palettes, but I'm just trying to enjoy this one and that's okay. We'll just not think about the other 2 I'm just not using very much. But spot number 1, I don't know if you guys are going to be surprised by this one or not, but I used this palette 31 times in Q3, and it is this little all matte eyeshadow palette from Milani. This is their Gilded Mini palette. This is in 110 Whiskey Business, and yeah, I just picked this up in July, and I already have pan in the lightest shade, but I use these lightest 4 shades all of the time. I reach for it constantly, and it's just such a good companion palette. I love using this one with the Huda Rose Quartz palette. I don't love all of the mattes in that palette, and so especially to have some lighter options to mix in with that makes it more wearable for me, and it helps me wear my more colorful palettes, which I love. So this one has been my number 1 palette from Q3. I used it 31 times. A couple of other numbers I like to share is my singles. I don't think I was the best at tracking my singles, honestly, because I do have that ColourPop single I use a lot in the inner corners, and I think I was forgetting to write that one down. So I only tracked using my singles 8 times in Q3, but I don't think that that's correct. I usually use singles like 30 plus times. So I think I did use it more than 8 times, but my tracking of it wasn't that good, especially with that inner corner one. I know I used that even more than 8 times on its own. So that wasn't the best. And then also right here on the screen, I will put the amount of days that I did not wear makeup in Q3. So I don't always wear makeup, especially on the weekends. Sometimes I won't wear makeup, but sometimes I will wear makeup but not eyeshadow. So this number is going to include both of those, whether I didn't wear any makeup or if I just didn't wear eyeshadow. So that number will have both of these. But that's going to be it for this Q3 ranking video. Let me know down below, were you guys surprised by any of these? Some of them I was surprised by, but honestly, seeing that the first, like the top half of the list just has more neutral palettes makes total sense to me. So that's fine with me. I really do love all the palettes that I have in my collection. So I'm excited to see that I'm using them, but it definitely does leave some room for wanting to reach for those lesser used palettes some more versus always reaching for the same ones. So I really want to try, especially next year. That's going to be something I really want to figure out how to incorporate on my channel, is just rotating through my palettes more frequently. So let me know if you guys have any ideas for that, but that's going to be all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this palette ranking video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel if you want to see the end of year ranking. That will be coming at the very end of December, and I will share the numbers from January through the end of the year. I'm super excited for that. It's one of my most anticipated videos for me for the whole year, so I hope that you guys enjoyed that too. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.